I want to talk a little bit about your intellectual development, because you said you started writing about these issues in the late 80s, early 90s. What got you interested in these issues of free expression?
Well, for me, I started writing around the mid-90s. In fact, I would have been too young to do so in the late 80s when I was still at school. It was in the mid-1990s, and I think one of the things that got me interested in it was the experience of visiting various campuses in the UK and realizing that the kind of censorship that we at Spike talk about a lot and which you at Fire talk about a lot had already started taking hold back then. I mean, you guys will know this from the American experience, where the kind of censorship we're seeing today is in some ways just a more extreme version of the kind of censorship that's been taken hold on campuses from the late 80s and the early 90s onwards. So back in the 1990s, I remember the National Union of Students, which is the national body in Britain that supposedly represents all students, was already enforcing no platform policies, which meant that certain speakers were denied platforms at campuses. In essence, they were banned from campuses, and that included neo-fascists, far-right organizations, Zionists, hard-right conservative politicians, and in some cases Christian fundamentalists. Those were the main people who were being banned in the mid-1990s. And the argument that I made, and which other people made at the time, was that if you ban these people, if you accept the censorship of these people, then it's going to inevitably spread and spread and spread to other groups of people who you might actually like, because you've instantly conceded on the principle of freedom of speech. And once you concede on the very principle, then the door is wide open to new forms of censorship, including against yourself. And that is exactly what has happened on UK campuses. That seed of no platform has grown and grown and grown, so that we now have a situation today where it's not only neo-fascists and hard right people who are being banned, it's also feminists, it's secularists who are presumed to upset Muslims, it's comedians, it's rappers, all sorts of people. So the experience in Britain, which is the experience through which I became interested in these issues and first started writing about them, is precisely that experience, that as soon as you give an inch on freedom of speech, they will take a mile. And I think that's the lesson people need to learn.
How have the arguments in favor of censorship, particularly on campus, but I'm willing to venture off campus here as well, changed from the mid-90s to today? Because in the mid-90s, at least in the United States, there seemed to be this emphasis on censorship in order to support, what are perceived to be oppressed minorities. You still see that to an extent today here in the United States, but you also see the medicalization of censorship in a certain way. Like, we are not strong enough to live in a society where free speech is protected. How do you see it in the UK?
Yes, I think it's a similar dynamic. I think in the past we had political censorship and religious censorship, not simply on campus, but in society at large. Those were the two main forms of censorship, and of course, artistic censorship. So the powers that be would clamp down on political views that they thought were dangerous, or would punish people who were blasphemous against particular religious ideas, or who produced art or literature that they thought was repulsive or obscene, and so on. So those were the key forms of censorship. What we have now, I think, those kinds of censorship have, to a certain extent, fallen out of favour, and would, I think, prove quite controversial. Even today, they might prove quite controversial, even though we live in fairly censorious times. But they've been replaced with something which in many ways is worse, which is therapeutic censorship, which is censorship designed not to protect a political ideal or to protect a religious figure, but to protect any individual who claims to have felt harmed or damaged by words or images that he or she has seen. So in essence, everyone now has a personal blasphemy law protecting them from offence if they want it. We're all like little Jesuses now who presume that we have the right to be force-fielded against things that offend our way of life. And that's the kind of censorship that has really spread on campuses here. It's therapeutic censorship, whereas there is this presumption of vulnerability on the part of young people in particular, many of whom embrace that idea of vulnerability, it must be said. There's this kind of extreme psychic vulnerability, where it's presumed that a book might harm you, a speaker you don't like coming to your campus could harm you, even if you don't go and see his or her speech, even if you're just in the same vicinity. It might, by osmosis, it might kind of damage your mind and make you feel wounded. Pop songs are being banned in Britain on campuses. 30 student unions in Britain have banned Robin Thicke's song Blurred Lines on the basis that it's damaging to women. Cambridge University recently banned a fancy dress party for Around the World in 80 Days because they thought people wearing costumes from the past would be cultural appropriation and might be racially insensitive. Other student unions in Britain ban sexual noises. So when you're in the bar, for example, and you've had 4 or 5 pints of beer, and you might make you might bark or whistle or make some kind of ridiculous noise, as 19-year-old lads are wont to do, that is now censored on some campuses. So there's this extraordinary level of censorship which can be aimed almost at any idea or any expression or any form of behavior, on the basis that everyone now deserves this kind of force field around them to protect them in a very therapeutic way from things that are presumed to be harmful to their mental health. That's the new kind of censorship we have in society at large, I think, but it's very, very pronounced on campus, this real new therapeutic censorship.
And what are the institutions in the UK that are fighting back against this? And can you give us a bit of a context of what the state of the law is over there? Because most of our listeners are here in the United States. We have the First Amendment. You do not. So what tools do you have to push back against these sorts of trends?
We have very few legal tools to fight back against this kind of thing. As you say, we don't have the First Amendment, so we can't simply go into onto these campuses and legally assert the right of these various students to express themselves and to organise as they see fit. There are numerous laws in Britain which restrict freedom of speech in some way. There's the Public Order Act. There is the Racial and Religious Hatred Act. There's the Malicious Communications Act of 2003, which has been particularly interventionist in internet freedom, and people have been imprisoned under the Malicious Communications Act for being grossly offensive. So in Britain, in the 21st century, you can be sent to jail for being grossly offensive. And we also, of course, have libel laws. We have the worst libel laws in Europe, which are hugely weighted in favour of the person who sues, which are so censorious and so unjust that they are used by Russian oligarchs, American celebrities, people from around the world come to London to sue the person who they think has defamed them, and that's why London is now referred to as a town called Sue. It attracts all these foreign claimants. So there are numerous pieces of legislation which restrict freedom of speech in a very real and quite terrifying way in Britain. Let me just give you a few examples of things that have happened. This is a country where you can be imprisoned for 4 months for singing an offensive song. This happened in Scotland last year. A man was walking to a football match. He was singing a song called the Billy Boys, which is an anti-Catholic song. Scottish football is notoriously sectarian. There are Catholic teams and Protestant teams, and they wind each other up by singing songs and making certain chants. He was singing this song, he was arrested, and he was jailed for 4 months under Scotland's Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which restricts what people can say, sing and chant and display at football matches. So this is a country where you can be jailed for singing in public. That's how bad things have got. And just recently, in the past few days, in fact, the Director of Public Prosecutions here has issued new rules about what can and can't be said on the internet. And she has said that people will be clamped down on very harshly if they are grossly offensive online, which can include using offensive hashtags on Twitter. You can now potentially be arrested for the hashtags you use on Twitter, and which can also include photoshopping an individual to make them look ridiculous in various different ways. So the noose is tightening around freedom of speech in British society at large, thanks to the law and thanks to what our politicians are pushing through. And I think my argument is that campus is merely a bizarre and in some cases more extreme expression of a censorship that actually gets the green light from officials themselves. So there are a huge number of problems in Britain in relation to free speech, and it can be difficult to challenge them because we don't have any constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech, which means you have to make the argument again and again on every single case that arises for freedom of speech and against censorship. And there is a fight back in Britain against the new censorship. So I read a piece for The Spectator a few weeks ago about the students who are now rising up against censorship on campus and who are passing motions that are unbanning newspapers. So some student unions, for example, had banned tabloid newspapers on the basis that they were misogynistic. Now there are groups of students who are challenging that, who are forcing through new votes and are winning them, and are winning the freeing of these tabloid newspapers so they're now available on campus. And in various other ways, students are setting up what they call speak-easy groups, free speech societies, and they are inviting the people they're not supposed to be inviting and having the conversations they're not supposed to be having. So there is a kickback, which I think is great and brilliant. But I do think that the problem of the therapeutic censorship, the spread of this therapeutic censorship, both through the academy and through society, is very powerful and is not going away anytime soon. So the kickback has to become stronger, more intellectually rooted, and needs to win more and more people to behind it. My experience in terms of speaking on campus in particular is a very interesting one, because on the one hand you do get a lot of hatred. When I spoke at the Oxford Union a couple of years ago, there was a protest outside, there was a candle-lit vigil for all the trans people who I had harmed. And of course what that means is that I've written some articles criticizing the politics of transgenderism and raising questions about the way in which it's enforced and the very censorious way in which it's protected from criticism. And then that leads to this candlelit vigil for all the victims of my articles. I mean, completely surreal. So I've encountered things like that. But then at the same time, it can be a joy because you meet all these students who are very interested in freedom of speech, who very interestingly often can't work out if they're right-wing or left-wing, and they're slightly confused, but they have this very strong instinct in favour of freedom of speech, in favour of trusting people to work out for themselves what is right or wrong, in favour of open public debate. And they don't have much purchase in public life. They don't have much of a platform, unlike the PC Brigade, which has a very large platform. They don't have a platform to express themselves. So when you meet them, it can be a really nice experience, and you give them advice and you tell them, maybe set up a society or do this or write articles or make your voice heard. So it's good to connect with those students, and it reminds you of a very important thing, which is that not all students have fallen into this trap.